A journalist once described Alexandra Morton as the citizen scientist who overcame intimidation by bureaucrats, indifference from government scientists, and dismissals from industry to force the plight of wild salmon to the top of British Columbia's political agenda. Initially a supporter of open net cage aquaculture in BC's pristine coastal waters, Alex Morton came to believe that fish farms on the migratory routes of wild salmon were actually causing the collapse of wild salmon stocks. Writing letters and petitions, doing original scientific research, appearing before inquiries and leading mass protests, she has generated an intense debate about the future of the iconic fish of the Pacific Northwest.
Thanks for coming up all this way to talk to me.
Oh, my pleasure. I want to just do this to some slight extent in a chronological way, because I think it's a fascinating story, quite aside from the issues that you've been grappling so fiercely with. You worked with Dr. Lilly, who was a legendary figure in cetacean research.
Yes.
And then you came here to study orca.
Yes.
What were you hoping to learn about the orca, or from the orca?
As a child, I was very curious about non-human communication because I felt wars and a lot of the misunderstandings that I experienced growing up were due to difficulty in communicating. And so basically, it was the primates or the cetaceans that were the large-brained, big communicators. And I just really didn't like the chimpanzees and the gorillas. But the dolphins attracted me. So I tracked down John Lilly and convinced him to let me go through the thousands of hours of audio tape that he had when he was trying to teach dolphins to speak English. It was an entire room up in his home in California that was wall-to-wall audio tapes, and I immersed myself in that world. And then I wanted to meet the actual dolphins themselves, and so I went to the local oceanarium and got to know some of the dolphins. And while I was there, the killer whales gave birth. It was the first time whales had given birth in captivity. And I moved my recording equipment to the tanks there. And the moment I heard the sounds of those whales, that was completely the animal for me. They're right in my hearing range, very polite talkers, very fascinating. And after a couple of years of working with them, I decided I needed to go and find their families in the wild. And because every family of whales speaks a different language or dialect, I wanted to find their family, which turned out to be a lot easier than you think. And they're just right out here in the waters of Johnstone Straits. And I wanted to understand another language. I felt that the human species has been too isolated in our own world. Turns out it's a lot harder to understand the orca than I thought because they see with sound as well as communicate with sound, but I did learn a great deal.
That's absolutely fascinating, and it sounded to me like it's a magic period in your life, right?
Very much so. I took one sniff of the coast up here, and this was my habitat. I immediately knew that. It was wet, it's wild, and the whales were here, and so I ended up living on a boat and traveling the coast and always trying to find a place to work with them year-round. And in 1981, we were going into some inlets in just an hour from here in the Broughton Archipelago. I followed a family of whales in, and I found a small community of people that were living there in float houses. And my husband and I lived in a boat at that time, and so we just tied up to the dock, and that became our home. And so for the first 10 years, I learned something new every time I went out with the whales. Nobody had studied them in the winter. I learned how they use the area, their traditional knowledge, that the salmon were driving them. I learned a lot about when they talk and what they talk about and how they make decisions and who's making the decisions. And I avoided every environmental issue that came my way. I did not want to hear about logging. I knew it was wrong to have whales in captivity, but I didn't do anything about it. But then when the salmon farms came into my area, first I thought, good idea. Yeah, we were in a small community of about 50 people, or no, I guess at that time it was about 150 people. A little one-room school, a post office where the mail came with a seaplane, and really a unique culture that had been going on for 100 years. And I thought that the fish farm industry would bring more people to the town to help keep the school open. But what happened was it was actually a big wheel that just crushed us. And now there's 8 people left. The Norwegian companies that are operating there don't hire local people because the local people were problematic. They didn't want to see the diseases pass to the wild fish. They didn't want to do a lot of the things they were asked to do. And I was just the biologist present and the only person with a word processor. When this began, they began in 1987. And for a few years, we didn't think there was a problem with them. The fishermen didn't like them, but I thought, maybe they just don't like new things that have to do with salmon in particular. But we had no rights. And we never asked the industry to go away. We just asked them not to displace us and to stay off the major migration routes and don't go on top of the prime fishing grounds. But they did. They went right into the vital organs of that archipelago and displaced my neighbors, displaced the whales. Then there was toxic algae blooms. Then there was Atlantic salmon in these Pacific rivers. Then there was disease problems. And I kept writing letters to the government, and I was convinced for a good decade that if I could just line my words up in the right order, they would understand this was a problem and just come in and fix it. Because in working with killer whales with the government, they were wonderful. The killer whale scientists were fantastic. So I expected the same thing when it came to salmon. But they kept saying to me, "Dear Ms. Morton, there is no evidence of toxic algae blooms, the whales being displaced, Atlantics being a problem." And it took me that long, a decade, to see that word "no evidence," those 2 words. Finally I was like, okay, they're not saying there's no problem. They're just saying there's no evidence. So, okay, I'll just roll up my sleeves, and I'm a biologist, I'll go get the evidence. And so that was another wonderful time period of just figuring out how to study sea lice and algae blooms and Atlantic salmon running around in the Pacific and things like that.
Mm-hmm. And just before we pursue that line, you've got a wonderful comment, I think in 2 or 3 places, to the effect that the wild salmon are the essential power cord that carries the energy up and down the coastline, the energy that it needs. Mm-hmm. So before we go on with that, can we just talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's a fabulously interesting and important concept.
Yes, so when I first came out to the archipelago, I really didn't notice the salmon. But gradually I began to see that everything was happening around them, the whales, the humans, the culture that had developed there. And I began to really look at them. And the moment the egg leaves the mother's body, it begins to feed the world around it. So trout and these little birds that run underwater called the water ouzels eat them. And then the little fish go to sea, and the mergansers are having their babies, the kingfishers are having their babies, the young coho and chinook, which are much bigger, feed voraciously on these swarms of beautiful little pink and chum salmon that come out of the rivers. And then they go to sea, and they basically collect the energy of sunlight hitting the open ocean. So when the sunlight hits the open ocean, plankton blooms start, good blooms, and then fish eat those, and then the salmon eat those. And so they collect up all that energy, and they come back to this coast on a schedule, to the exact place they respond. So now all these other organisms have set their clock to them. They need them to get the fat to hibernate. They need them to raise their offspring. And the incredible thing about the Pacific salmon is there's 5 of them, and they all fit a different niche in the river. You've got your mountain climbing coho, you've got your chum salmon that don't want to go very far, and everybody in between. So the river is maximized to these fish, and they actually carry nitrogen up into the water system, into the watersheds. And scientists who track this ocean nitrogen called nitrogen 15, they find it in alpine meadows, in the trees. The growth rings of trees are bigger when there's a big salmon run. You can actually track your salmon runs with the growth rings of the trees. So you've got your animals eating the fish directly, and then you've got them moving off and the waste passing through them, or you have eagles taking these things up into trees and it falling down. The nitrogen from the ocean has been found in the flesh of mountain goats.
Really?
So that's something that went into the grass up at some very high elevation, and the goats eat it. So if you could imagine, as these fish come back, everything's just turning green around them. They're just bringing life. They are the bloodstream. And the tides are like the lungs, and they are breathing in and out, but the salmon are the bloodstreams carrying the nutrients. And the more I deal with this issue, the more I see that humanity is not recognizing these major power cords that connect us to huge resources of energy. That open ocean is like a solar panel, like, we've never built. And these fish are plugging us into it. And so we don't want to break these cords.
I guess one of the things that fascinates me about hearing that is that as we've been going around talking to people in many different areas of the environment, one of the messages that comes back is it's incredibly sophisticated, it's incredibly interconnected, and human beings have very rarely appreciated more than the tiniest segment of it.
We have failed to recognize the big machines on this planet. When I look at a salmon farm and I see the little generators running on fuel that's come from somewhere else, and the fish have come from somewhere else, and the food has come from Chile, that is a tenuous, fragile system. But when you look at the mountains over here, and the clouds come in from the Pacific, and they rear up over it, and they form rain, which is filling these watersheds where this amazing animal is coming from the open ocean, and life is just boiling over. That's the big machine. That's what we really need to learn to dovetail into. Instead of cutting these lines, we're going to leave ourselves with nothing. And between the biologists and the engineers, there's a lot of understanding around this, but they just need to be allowed to work with these systems.
And so the farm salmon really intrude on this whole bloodstream, in effect. Right?
They do. So the basic problem with farm salmon is they break the natural laws. In nature, the wild salmon is always moving, so the waste never collects. And pathogens have a lot of trouble jumping fish to fish because they're constantly moving. And any salmon that's a little bit slow, a little bit wobbly on the edge of the school, there's a predator takes it out. At every age class and size, there's always predators trimming up these schools. And so you don't get epidemics. And then there's this other really amazing thing that happens. All the Pacific salmon that come back to the rivers, these are fish that have gone out to sea. They have fed successfully. They have found their river again. They have found the exact patch of gravel where they were spawned. And when they're done spawning, they die. You'd think nature would say, hey, go out there and do it again, but not so. And so in considering this, biologists suspect that this breaks the cycle of disease. So then you take now a salmon farm. It really doesn't matter what you put in there, whether you put a Pacific salmon or an Atlantic salmon, it's the same dynamic. The wild fish come by and they infect the farm fish. That's definitely part of the dynamic. Sea lice, viruses, bacteria. The wild fish go into the rivers, they die. The farm fish, everybody is pressed together, and so the pathogens are having a heyday. They're jumping fish to fish to fish, and now they're competing against each other, so it increases virulence. This has actually been studied. It makes them more virulent because there's no longer any reason for those pathogens to live lightly on their host. And then spring comes, and the little salmon come out of the river. They should not be meeting big schools of adult fish, but they're slamming into we learned at the Cohen inquiry, 60 billion viral particles can come out per hour from a fish farm with a disease problem. So they simply weren't designed. A lot of them don't even have scales, which is their coat of armor. And so they're just coming out naked into this, and they're not surviving it.
And so as you look at the salmon farms, so you've got the diseases, you've got the parasites, quite a range of parasites, I gather.
There's a range of parasites, yeah.
And I gather some of those are destroyed by when the adult fish go into freshwater, but these fish never go into freshwater, so the parasites just...
That's right. The sea lice problem that is so prevalent right now, wherever there's these Atlantic salmon farms, those sea lice die in freshwater. So the natural system has again evolved. And sea lice, they don't actually want to kill the salmon they're on. That's their whole planet. And so in the real world, in the natural world, very few sea lice get on there. But in the farms, they just keep multiplying, and they cover the farm fish and they cover the wild fish.
So is it fair to say that industrial aquaculture, like industrial agriculture, creates unbelievably dense quantities of waste and also provides a real wonderful feeding ground for all these undesirable characters?
Yes.
But also would be impossible without petrochemicals.
Yes.
Wouldn't it?
Completely an oil-based food production system because, first of all, they're bringing the eggs from the Atlantic and bringing them here. And then they hatch the fish and then they carry them in trucks and boats and they go into tubes and they go into the farm. The food for these things is coming from Chile and it gets transported up here. So it's starving one ocean, transported the length of the globe, ground up, taken back out in boats and thrown back in the water to make less fish. And then the fish need to be distributed from there out to the clients. And the trouble with the industry is not only that, but it's based on share prices. So these fish are commodities. So the farmer, the fish farmer, which in British Columbia are 92% Norwegian owned, he doesn't really care how the one farm is doing or how productive that one farm is. He's concerned with the growth of the share price. This is a fatal collision with the natural world because the natural world wants everything to work in concert. And ecosystems are not lovely things. They're fierce. They grind each other down. Any organism that gets out of line is just ground right down until it's a fine-honed machine. You just add sunlight and water, and you get these miraculous diversity of life that's what naturally happens on Earth. You get these systems that produce an amazing array of life. But if you have an organism that can only survive if it grows, that is what we call cancer. If you have one organism in these channels and you need more and more and more of them and more and more and more of them, you know at some point there's going to be system collapse because nature is dedicated to wiping those out. So viruses, bacteria, parasites, you do not want to underestimate them. I call them the little guys. And salmon farms, the best thing that happened to them since the glaciers were seeded here 10,000 years ago. They have never had the opportunities they have now in these farms. And that means more mutation rates because everybody's, jumping fish and easily surviving. There's no predators to take anybody out, even if you're like half keeled over as a fish and very contagious. You still survive long enough to be shedding these things. Very dangerous human behavior to allow the pathogens to behave like this.
Well, and curiously, the pathogens are dining on corporate fat.
They definitely are. Yeah, they definitely are. And I don't know where these corporations think their children are going to go because we're all on this planet together. As I try to deal with this industry and bring some reason to the situation, I keep saying to these people, I am working for your children too. I understand you're on this train and you can't get off. You don't see an easy way to get off, but you're doomed for failure. The pathogens are becoming more virulent, you're running out of food, and now all these companies are failing on the stock market because they've overproduced. It turns out everybody needs the same thing, and that's fewer farm salmon, including them.
What a catastrophic result.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, what happens to Alex Morton is, having started out studying cetaceans, you've now become, in effect, a salmon salmon ecosystem biologist, right? You're now a fisheries biologist more than
Yeah, so I'm a number of things and hard for people to really pigeonhole because, yes, I've gone out and done the original work on sea lice. I've produced co-authored 20 papers on sea lice in the best journals around the world because I thought that was the thing to do. I've done work on what happens to escaped Atlantic salmon. Do they learn to feed? Yes, they do. Work like that. But within the last 2 years, I'm just trying to protect my home. So first of all, this is not a job for me. I survive basically on handouts. It's quite interesting. I'm just about flat out, and then somebody comes along with a few $100s or a couple $1,000s, and because people are depending on me now, which is a big responsibility, and I hope I don't let them down. But I went from just doing science to trying to communicate to people that it's really up to them. The government, I don't think, can turn this thing around. I think they're in arrangements with these companies. The companies can't turn it around because of corporate laws. They are bound in very strict ways to their shareholders. And the only power to stop this is the people. But the people think they're powerless. And so, now I guess people call me an activist, but it is all to the same goal. I love my home. I love that archipelago. I've raised 2 children there. I can see how it breathes. It's part of me. I work for that system. And I've just had to be endlessly creative in how to bring some reason to the situation.
Well, in a curious sense, having been engaged with the ecosystem in the archipelago, you're now engaged with the human ecosystem, with the structures of human activity, right? And one of the things that you've had to do is to say who's regulating this industry and who's promoting it, and that brings you into the whole area of the ecology of government. Right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. So I'm a person who went out to the wilderness to study how animals communicate. Talking to bureaucrats and politicians has been learning a whole new language. And I do feel I have an advantage because I've spent 20 years looking at animals and trying to figure out their behavior. So when I get into a group of humans, they give themselves away all the time with their behavior. There's quite a lot to read there. But yeah, I would suggest anyone who wants to become a biologist today, take some social sciences courses, figure out how government works, because I wasted a lot of time talking to the guys on the top. They're the figureheads. You need to talk to the bureaucrats. You need to end up talking to all levels, but you don't want to you cannot go to government and ask them to change. You have to go to government and tell them what needs to be done. You really can't ask them. I had the remarkable experience of being a participant in the Cohen inquiry for the last year, and 500,000 documents were given to the inquiry for the participants like myself to read. So I spent probably 2,000 hours going through their emails. It was just like one big, okay, that's what you guys are thinking. That's what you're talking about. All they're trying to do is protect themselves. When there's a problem with the fish, they just start writing media lines. They have become a life force that is more concerned about themselves. That's my Skype.
And then Alexandra had to break off for a scheduled interview with the national news network via Skype.
Hello.
Hey, CBC here.
It's unnerving because you can see yourself.
Well, after 2 days of major delays, travelers flying out of Pearson International Airport in Toronto say every year, sockeye salmon go up the Fraser River system in BC and head for the Adams River to spawn. This is the second year in a row that the salmon are returning in strong numbers after a 10-year decline. In 2009, the return was so low, the federal government called a public inquiry to examine the apparent collapse of the Fraser River sockeye fishery. Early numbers indicate that this year is already looking promising. But for more on this year's salmon run, we've reached biologist Alexandra Morton, and she joins us via Skype from Sointula, BC. So Alexandra, nearly 500,000 salmon are expected in this year's run. Is that good news?
It is good news, yes. It's wonderful to see those fish coming back because they're so important to the coast.
Tell us a bit more about how the salmon run works. How do the salmon know where to return to?
Well, that's a really good question. They leave the river and are tasting their way all the way out, and we believe they taste their way back. So every bit of the river has a slightly different chemical composition, and they appear to remember that and follow it back. So they come down the coast and they'll get the scent of the Fraser River and turn in, and away they go.
So a quick question here. So as you mentioned, I mean, they're out there, and salmon spend their adult lives in the ocean, and they may end up as far away as Japan. Will those fish be tested for exposure exposure to radiation after the nuclear disaster there?
Apparently, the Canadian Food and Health Inspection Agency is doing that, and as I understand, they didn't find anything. I think we'd have to look at it also for next year as well. It's definitely something that has been done, but it appears that the fish are clean this year.
Alexandra, I mentioned in the intro that before last year, going back to 2009 and before that, salmon numbers were declining and collapsed. What was behind the drop in the numbers?
Well, the Cohen inquiry, just to wrap up, as a participant, I looked through 500,000 documents that were provided by government on this issue. And the only variable that fits the timing of it and which runs were collapsing was the salmon farming industry. And so what happened was in 1992, salmon farms were put on the migration route of some of the Fraser sockeye. And only those runs are declining. The ones that go around southern Vancouver Island have been increasing over this time period. There was also a disease associated with these farms called salmon leukemia. And when a researcher with DFO, Fisheries and Oceans, looked at the fish in 2006, she found evidence that they were fighting this very same disease. And then these Chinook salmon farms were removed from the migration route of the Fraser sockeye, and boom, we got back the 2010 run, which was biggest in 100 years, and then this year very good again. So a lot more work needs to be done, but we're hoping that the Cohen inquiry might restrict salmon farms on the migration route of these wild sockeye.
Now, I know it must be incredibly hard to predict, but what do you think going forward? Are these numbers going to stay on the up and up, or what do you think?
I think it really depends on the salmon farms and the diseases, because one of the things I also found in the records that I read through is there's suggestion of exotic viruses in the Atlantic salmon farms, and our fish just aren't going to be equipped for that. So if we allow the fish to get to sea without being infected with disease, I think that these runs should continue, because there appears to be something actually good going on in the North Pacific right now. We have more humpback whales than we've had in a long time. The Alaska's having good runs. The other side of the ocean is having good runs. So there's no reason why we shouldn't have good runs too, if we can just allow them to get to sea without a tremendous disease load.
We hope it keeps working. And
I agree.
Alexandra, thanks so much for this.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much. You're clear.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.
Okay, see ya. Bye.
Oh, I see a stored in...
Zoom, zoom, zoom.
When the CBC came on, you were talking about the bureaucrats as being a life force that's more about themselves than about anything else.
Yeah, so this is something I've discovered also with environmental organizations. Any group of people that gets into too big an organization, it looks to me like they become less adaptive and listening to what's going on outside. And so, for example, within Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the federal agency that regulates our wild fish, I can see there's many very good people. Many people are far more educated than I am about these fish, but they are suppressed. And the top level is all about making it appear that they're doing something. They have forgotten that you've really got to go out and look. So for example, in the Fraser sockeye, there's been a problem escalating since the mid-90s where more and more of these fish are dying before they're spawning. It's called pre-spawn mortality. And they're entering the river too early, right when the river is just at its very warmest, which is deadly for these fish. And so there's been a small army of federal scientists in the rivers going, okay, these are the worst gills I've ever seen. Their kidneys are off, but the outside of the fish looks fine. They're dying of everything but the kitchen sink, says one person. But we have no funds. We don't even have money to get samples couriered down from the upper reaches of the river to the labs. And while all this was going on, the management level was like, no problem. No, we don't have a problem. And I would write letters and they'd be, no, we think it's water temperature. But the people on the river are saying it's not water temperature because they're dying later on. And so eventually what happened was they tasked an incredible woman, Dr. Christy Miller. And she's not only a very good scientist, but she's also quite bold and outspoken. And she used a different technique than everybody where she looked at the cells. And in our cells, there's all these switches, tens of thousands, that turn on and off depending on what experience we have. It's like a living braille. And when she read that pattern, she's like, okay, virus. And the moment that she thought it was a virus from salmon farms, the upper management began to shut the doors around her. Nope, you can't go to many meetings. Nope, you can't talk to the press. And actually, you don't get any more money to study Fraser sockeye. So this woman who deserves the Order of Canada, who figured it out, she crossed the line because the policy within DFO was fish farms are not a problem. The same thing happened with our cod on the East Coast. There was a scientist named Dr. Ransom Myers who was within the federal fisheries, and he's like, you know, we're catching these fish before they've spawned. It was that easy. Policy said fish were fine. It was a few too many seals. And so when he came up with his theory, which was based on an enormous amount of research, they said, nope, you sit down and be quiet. And he quit. He said it took him 3 minutes, he quit. But he wasn't able to save the cod. And we have the same situation going on right now where this woman, she's figured it out. The timing, everything fits perfectly. The symptoms, which runs are declining, which runs aren't. It's plain as the nose on our faces. But policy says this can't be true because the farms are good. So reading all the documents in the Cohen inquiry was incredibly educating to me, and I realize now that there's no way to fix that system from the inside. You have to have the public pressure from the outside. And how much pressure it's going to take, I don't really know, but that's what's required.
You know, Ransom Myers said something to me one time that I've never forgotten, and he said that what struck him about the bureaucrats he was dealing with was that he said it sounds crazy when you say it, you think it can't be true, but this is the impression that they gave, was that if they could only make everybody agree to what they were saying, then that would be reality. And, and the fish, the evidence would conform to their views of it, you know?
Yes.
And I kind of understand that. I think that may very well be so, you know? But
I really saw that in the documents, and then when all these guys were on the stand, they just repeat things over and over and over again that aren't true. And try to make it true. The trouble they're having with me is I've done all the time right on the water with the fish. So for example, with sea lice, they're trying to blame this little fish called stickleback. Hey guys, it's not stickleback because the females don't grow up and have eggs. So there's no way a stickleback is creating sea lice. But it comes up over and over and over again. I'm like, oh my gosh, are we really going to do stickleback again? Yeah.
There's another problem that you've mentioned, and I think I'm quoting you when I say no government in Canada will take responsibility for fish farms, and so the industry is out of control, and people like us are going in circles trying to find out who's in charge.
Yes, so they had it all split up, so you went to the province. The province says, oh no, DFO says it's fine. You go to DFOs, they're like, yeah, we said it's fine, but it's the province that's actually giving them the licenses. So I took all these characters to court 2 years ago in BC Supreme Court, and I won and got it taken away from the province. Because the whole problem with the province, well, just to back up, when the industry first came to Canada in the 80s, the federal government went for an opinion. They went to a lawyer named Bruce Wildsmith and said, what is the legality of raising salmon in the ocean? And he looked at it and he said, I can't see that the government has any right to do this, because you're not allowed to own a fish in the ocean and you're not allowed to privatize ocean spaces. So he said, you're going to have to change the Constitution of Canada. What happened instead, because that turned out to be kind of a big project, they gave it to the province. And bingo, they became farms. Okay, now everybody knew what they were. They're farms. And so the province went about regulating what was going on inside the farm with no responsibility to the wild fish. And the federal government just put one big blanket, sure, fine, go for it, it's fine. So they didn't analyze each site, the conditions of each place. So yeah, I was just going around and around in a circle. I'm still circling a bit, but at least now the federal government is in charge. The provincial government is still leasing them the seafloor. They're the landlords of this industry. So they could make the decision to get these off the migration routes. I feel like I'm explaining the birds and the bees to people all the time. Okay, guys, we can't do photosynthesis. So we need the plants, we need the algae out there, and these fish, they collect this up and they are growing the trees that make the oxygen that you are breathing. Every time it blows southeast through the city of Vancouver, people are breathing oxygen made by salmon. We forget that connection. I feel like we're, crazed on lawnmowers running over these big power lines. We don't even know they're there. And yet we are depending on them. As an animal, we have put ourselves in a very precarious position because we don't understand where we are in this system. We think food comes on styrofoam under plastic. We don't think of what happens before then. We think oxygen is just there, and we don't value it because we're not paying for every lungful. And yet we die without it within moments.
In terms of the failure to regulate or the failure to pay attention, actually the failure to attend to reality is what we're really talking about here, isn't it?
It is, failure to attend to reality.
Yeah. Why? I mean, there's an inertia that comes from sort of groupthink that we've just been talking about. But beyond that, why would the Canadian governments be so compliant? I mean, they have watched rules broken, they've watched laws broken, didn't they exempt fish farms from fisheries regulations?
Yes.
Totally.
Yeah.
Why would they do that?
So the why is really the one question I can't answer, because looking at it from the bottom up and looking through all this life, I know we need it to survive, and I know their children need it as well as my children. But I think it's more what I learned reading all those documents. It was just so educational for me. You go one step after the next, and there's a little turn in each step, and I couldn't tell my friends what I was learning in these documents because it was confidential, and I would just describe it. I am chasing a greased pig on M.C. Escher's staircases. We start going in one direction, and the next thing you know, we're in an impossible situation, upside down, inside out. It doesn't make sense when you look at the whole picture, but each step made sense to the people that took them. And there's a few people in there that are the architects of this, but the rest of them are just following it along. And the way everybody's in their little trenches, and so even on an email, if you're CC'd, you don't answer. It's not your problem. It's just that first person. And so the people in the federal government didn't read the disease records that the provincial government was producing. The provincial government did not look at what was happening to those Fraser sockeye up in the river. And the corporations have the lobbyists, and they go in and they've got the key to every door. They're like, okay, here's what we need. We need you to do this, this, and this. And the government people look at the list and they go, oh yeah, I can do that. And away they go. The rest of us, which I guess we can call the 99% now, we're out here in gumboots and Stanfields, and we don't have an organized lobby. We don't really sometimes know what we're asking for, except that we don't want to be squashed lifeless. I mean, that would be high on our list. And so I think that the politicians have just responded to the people that meet them on their grounds. And I highly suggest people stop asking government to do anything, and you start telling them. You say, I need this, this, and this, and this, and I want you to get back to me within this time period and tell me what you've accomplished. Go to government for your permits and your applications and many other things, but don't ask them to make a decision about life on Earth right now, because it's not built into policy. And I mean, what I see in my community was that we, as humans that wanted to survive, had no right. If you want to keep a salmon feedlot out of your migration route, you can't just say, I don't want it. I don't want them to kill off all the fish. You have to come at them with an economic argument. You have to make something up that nobody really knows how to do. You don't know what it is you can say that will supersede those corporate laws. Because the corporate laws is what the companies are operating under. They have to make that share price grow, even if they're killing the planet. It's really, as a biologist, I see everything in terms of animals. And the corporate animal is a dangerous creature because it doesn't even exist in 3 dimensions. So when we talk about an ecosystem being these gears that are grinding things down and they're honing everything so that it becomes a perfect machine, that corporate animal is not even in there. It's kind of like a big mosquito, and he goes along and he just, dips in and sucks out the energy. It's like pomegranate seeds. If you look at ecosystems are like pomegranate seeds. They're pressed up against each other, and they have a discrete membrane, but they are beside each other, and there's some organisms that thread them together, like salmon. But the corporate animal just feeds off of each one. pops them, they just become a slurry, takes out the mechanism that makes them work. But the corporate animal's fine because it doesn't really exist. This is a dangerous animal to have ranging over the planet right now. We have to, I understand there's good corporations and I understand there's good CEOs, but the model is dangerous because it's not alive. And we are. And it doesn't respect life. So,
that's a fascinating way of looking at it. And they have been given the rights of persons, but they're not persons.
Yes.
They have no emotions, they have no children, they have none of those things that make us human.
I know.
Yeah.
And yet they're full of people who are destroying their own children by running those processes.
Mm-hmm. And what you've described really is a substitution of a bureaucracy for a democracy, right? That we don't really have. That's what you're telling us, isn't it? This is not really a democratic way of governing.
Yeah, I last spring I had an idea with a couple of friends to walk down Vancouver Island here. It's 500 kilometers. When we got to the bottom of it, we had 5,000 people with us. And I got up there and I said, this is a test. Is this a democracy? This is the last thing I wanted to get into as a biologist, but if people don't grab onto democracy right now, we will lose it. You know, I feel that we're not that far away that the corporations are just going to say, hey, you know what, guys, we're the boss. There's actually no government here. And that's going to hurt everybody. You know, one thing I try to communicate all the time, the vision I have for this coast, the power that I can see in these natural systems and how it benefits people, there are no losers here at all. Not a one. These people that can grow salmon in pens, that's amazing. They know, they understand fish. They can make them grow in an environment that unnatural. Imagine if we harness that to working with the powerful natural system, with these fish that find the rivers themselves. We really need to decide what we want here. And for me, the least expensive, most powerful and beneficial fish on this coast are the ones that do it themselves, and we just work with them, rather than, you know, something that we have to have on our artificial life support all the time.
That's a very heartening vision of the future, isn't it? Taking all that ingenuity that's now, in a sense, mashing things up and making it and turning it into a creative force. Yes,
we need to unleash the engineers and the biologists, because the biologists really understand a lot about life. Obviously, they don't understand everything, but we know a lot. And the engineers can figure pretty well everything out. It's amazing in the ways you can get energy. Everything else on Earth is able to survive. Massive organisms can survive based on the sun, the water. You know, we can do that. We've just decided not to for a while, but we really need to get back to that.
So in a curious way, you start out listening to whales talking, and you wind up having to deal with governments and policy, and right? It's a remarkable progression.
Well, I've read every book on anybody's gone into the wilderness. They all end up in my shoes, and the books are all the same. So like the first third is the miracle of going out there and learning about an environment and the animals and the people. The next third is, this animal that I now love and understand is being destroyed by something that isn't even working for the people. And the third part of the book is them trying to figure out how to deal with it. And no matter what you do on Earth today, you have to consider the people. And, you know, as a biologist starting out, I was pretty ruthless. But then I lost my husband. He drowned. And the enormity of that event in my life made me incredibly compassionate. It added that to my character. And so I rarely get angry anymore. We are acting like 5-year-olds here, running around just breaking stuff because we can, you know, being bullies, beating up with bad behavior, you know. But we have the capacity. So when I've done the walk, I did this walk 500 kilometers with people, then 100 of us got into 10 big canoes and canoed for 10 days down the lower Fraser River to get to the Cohen inquiry to ask one question, and that was, please release the disease records from the fish farms. When we were on the river, it was First Nations, grandparents, children. It was uncomfortable. It was windy and cold, and we were camping in sometimes dump sites, and First Nations welcomed us into our territory. I just saw the best of people for 10 days. And I didn't really like people in the beginning of my life, but I love them now. I love the creativity, the altruism, people will self-sacrifice. I see what people do for wild salmon. There's some kind of really interesting relationship between people and wild salmon. People will work really hard for these fish. I would like to be Director General of DFO Pacific Region, and I would take a whole bunch of people out of the weeds, and I'd say, you're in charge of this, and you're in charge of this. I would take some of that top management. I was like, okay, guys, step away from the fish. I don't know what you're doing, but you could just go do something else. And
you're retired.
You're retired. And I would knit together all these people out in remote communities who are slaves to these salmon. They love them. They're not even profiting from them. And, I've traveled the watershed and met a lot of these people. And they always say, they tell me this wealth of information, and then they say, yeah, but I'm not the expert. That's DFO. And I'm like, you are the expert. You are the holders of the knowledge of these fish and what they need. And I would empower those people. That's what needs to happen. There's remarkable people everywhere. People often say to me, Alex, you're only talking to the converted. Yep, that's all I want to talk to, because we are the majority. We understand what we need to survive.
So where does the Cohen inquiry fit in all of this? I mean, it's taken up an enormous amount of your time. You've obviously thought it was well worthwhile.
Yes. Well, I've engaged in a lot of government processes. I've given them all my all. I really throw myself into them. And every single one of them produces the same report, which says you got to separate the wild fish and the farm fish, just because those farm fish are breaking the natural laws and you can't have them together. Every one of those reports has just been put on a shelf. But the interesting thing is always the process. So the people who meet, the people who watch other people engaged in this. And for me, for the Cohen inquiry, it was reading all these emails. I mean, for 2 decades, when the government would answer me, I'd be like, oh, what are these guys thinking? This doesn't make sense. Well, now I know what they're thinking. I know what they're thinking about me. I know what they're thinking about a lot of things. I'm on a totally new playing field now. And I can see nobody's really bad and wrong. Justice Cohen strikes me as a deep thinker, a remarkable man. I find myself really liking him, even though he very rarely says anything. But even if he comes out with an inspired recommendation, which really is just get these farms off the migration route of the fish, Stephen Harper makes the decision what happens to that report. And I don't think people really want to wait for that. I think that we need to step up and just, if there's a problem with this industry and there's 1,000 jobs in the industry, let's just find jobs for these people. Never mind the Norwegians do not want to take these things and put them on land. They've shown us that. They've demonstrated that. I went to Norway to the AGMs of these companies, and I told them, you're going to have to get off the migration route. And they're like, no, sorry, we're not going. But the CEO for the biggest company, Marine Harvest, at the time was a woman named Os Michelet, and she invited me in for an evening meeting just before I left, and she's like, what do you want? I was like, you just got to get off the migration routes. She was a very truthful, and I really liked her, but she just said to me, we can't do that, because it'll damage our share price. And I just went, okay, well then you guys just have to get out of the water. You got to go home. You have 1,000 farms in Norway. If you can't make a go of it there, you can't be here. There are Canadians who contact me regularly who want to do something much smarter on land. There is a guy doing it now in Quebec, aquaponics, and he grows 640 pounds of trout a week and 18,000 heads of organic lettuce. So the Norwegian model, where you go and catch a bunch of fish in Chile and you bring them up the length of the planet and you grind them into pellets and you put them into plastic bags, you throw them into the water, it goes through their fish once and then it's all over the seafloor of British Columbia, smothering coral reefs and sponges and habitat and on and on. But what these other people want to do is take that waste and grow a crop and grow another crop until you have nothing. And then you start over and you add more. And I think that really needs to be mandated. If you're going to take a kilogram of ocean protein now, today, you have to show that you're going to use that until it is ether. just keep using it, because that's the only thing that works on Earth. That's the basic building block. Everything is reused. It's only recently that we even believed in garbage. We pretend it goes away, but we know it doesn't. So aquaculture is not the problem. It's a great thing. Fish apparently use protein very, very efficiently. But it's this relentless corporate model of growth, 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 growth. And the pathogens are just going, yippee, this is great for us. And eventually they wipe themselves out, and that's what's going to happen here. And all these towns that have built up around it will be hurt. So, yeah, we have to just reorganize where it happens. So I'm hopeful that Cohen will see that. But I'm not going to sit back and just wait for that man to make a decision and then the next guy to make a decision after that.
So what will you do instead?
Communicate, communicate, communicate. So the pattern, everybody's running around, what happened to the Fraser sockeye? And at first I didn't know anything about these fish because I'm from a little farther north, but the pattern is so bold. Okay, so the sockeye began to go down in 1992, exactly the year that salmon farms were put on their migration route. Those salmon farms had a problem with a virus. They think it's a virus. They never really did figure out what it was, but they named it salmon leukemia because it had a lot of leukemia-like characteristics. And so 20 years later, the Fisheries and Oceans task a scientist to figure out, why are all these salmon dying in the river before they've spawned? Why are the sockeye of the Fraser River going down when the rivers all around are doing fine? And she says, it looks like a virus. And when she tries to figure out what virus it is, she says, wow, that looks a lot like salmon leukemia. And the fish farmers then take away the farms that had the salmon leukemia, and the Fraser sockeye come back. It's a really clear pattern. Of course, the fish farmers didn't tell anybody they were taking those fish out, so nobody knew that was the reason. I found that in the records. Nobody is telling the scientists at DFO that disease symptoms are still happening in the farm fish. Everybody was in their little boxes. Nobody connected the dots. But I have, and I put it all into a 60-page report. And when I got on the stand, I tried to give this to the judge, and the lawyer for Canada stood up and he said, nope, you can't do that, it's hearsay. I'm like, yeah, I heard, and I'm saying. He's like, nope, can't do that, you have to use your voice. It's like, okay, I'll tell you the story. And then he's like, nope, you can't do that because you're not a vet. So he closed all the doors. The audience was full, there was live streaming cameras, and all he did was to attack me personally. Yesterday, the judge released my report. So next week it will come out. But whether people will actually read it and understand it, I don't know. But the pattern is so clear. So I'm hopeful.
So that's what's happened today, is that
yes.
The report has been released.
Yeah.
On the Thanksgiving weekend.
Yes, really, 2 hours before the Thanksgiving weekend.
Yeah. But nevertheless, it's there. Do you have signs that there will be some uptake on it and some? Well,
my life purpose for the next few months is going to be to brief various groups on it, make myself available. For example, I was in a lot of conflict as I began to read these disease records that exotic diseases look like they were here, salmon leukemia, brain tumors in these fish. I live in a First Nations territory, and they're not responsible for me, but I feel responsible to them. They're very kind to let me live in their territory, and so I'm going to start with briefing the chiefs and the people of the Broughton Archipelago, and then the First Nations of the Fraser River, and then the people that also live on the river, and then the fishing groups, and anyone who wants to hear from me. I will give them my time and just lay out what government has been saying about these fish. This is not Alex's theory. This is what they are all saying. And when you put together what they're saying, it's really easy what's going on. So I'm putting together a small book that's going to put it in a really clear and graphic manner, and attend every scientific meeting I can, talk to every scientist I can, First Nations, local people, anyone who wants to know. I am not going to force anybody to listen to me, but if you truly want to figure this out, it's pretty clear what needs to be done.
You had some quite striking graphics, as I recall, that actually showed in a visual form the same time.
Yes,
Yeah.
the numbers are speaking clearly. The fish are speaking clearly. You know, when you have the fish going along like this and suddenly, boom, they go down like that. And that is the exact year that fish farms went in with that disease. And then those farms with the disease are taken out and the fish bounce back up. And nobody knew. So that's kind of a blind, it's a perfect scientific experiment. Now, it was done almost by mistake, but I think actually the fish farm industry could see what was happening and they pulled those fish out.
Hey, this has been wonderful. Do you still dream of getting back to orca research?
I do. I really do. And more than that, once these fish farms are out of the Broughton Archipelago, and they're going to go one way or another because right now their stocks are crashing because they've overproduced, I want to go in and work with the biologists and the First Nations and the local people to bring those fish back. And I want to show people that it's not that hard. Don't do a hatchery. You've got to let these fish pick their own mates. They're very good at it. They rapid evolve with great skill so that they tune themselves to the rivers. And as climate change does happen to us, the best chance we have with these fish is to let them do it. And try to teach people to work with these natural systems. So have small teams out rotating through these rivers. Always just watch. You know, see what's going on, see what you can do. And I think that what will happen there will spread coast-wide. People will realize, okay, we do need these fish and they are much more resilient than we thought. The city of Vancouver should be called the city of the salmon. I mean, there is a major world city that has the biggest salmon run in the world going right between its city streets. It doesn't even seem to notice. That has to change. We have to see the value in that, the enormous value. Those fish are making oxygen. They go into the province and they spread out just like a bunch of veins feeding us. So I want to get back to whales, but the biggest dream that I have right now is to bring back the home that I love so much and try to teach people that we can do it. People know it, but it's not really acceptable behavior right now to protect your home and to work with these natural systems. So I'd like to break that mold and start this.
That could be a slogan for the whole entire movement. The entire environmental movement is a little out of fashion to protect your home, but that's what we got to do.
Yes, you know, there's this phrase, NIMBY, and people always say, oh, Alex, you're NIMBY. I say NIMBYs unite, because where you are is where you're the most powerful. You're home, you know the players, you know what's going on, and really everybody just has to take a stand, because the Norwegian salmon farming industry is an invasion. And if you see it that way, it has to be stopped. There has to be other solutions. But it doesn't mean hurting the local people or economy. Somehow we've been duped into thinking this economy is good for us. No, it's not. We have 8 people left in my town. The school is closed. We have 27 Norwegian feedlots. That's good for some economy, maybe way up here in the stratosphere, but it's not good for our economy, the one I live in and my neighbors live in. And so people have been very gentle with these corporations because it's good for the economy. We let a lot happen to us. But people, I think, have to take a stand and realize this is about saving ourselves. This is about life on Earth. And our children are going to be furious because they are not going to be surviving us because we are just robbing the planet and polluting it so heavily. So I see the movement that's happening, Occupy Wall Street. It's like, oh yeah. I mean, the best sign I saw was, dear 1%, we were asleep, now we're awake, the 99%. And what the 1% need to realize is we're working for them. Like these kids were saying in the street to the police around them, we're protecting your pension, we're protecting your children. And it needs to be peaceful and it needs to be powerful. And we're a remarkable animal when we put our mind to it.
Alexandra Morton, citizen, scientist, and passionate advocate for the wild salmon that are the very symbol of the Pacific Coast. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. See you next time.